Alrighty, everybody. It is currently Sunday, December 14th, 2025, and I'm coming at you live from the deep underground military base that's buried underneath of the Denver airport. Because today we're getting conspiratorial on them. Talking conspiracy theories, last week's episode, it we went a little off the beaten path, and I wish I would have stayed on the path beaten off. You know what I mean? um, I, I, yeah, I'm not great at reading, especially out loud. When I read in my head, I can do it pretty well because I can just skip over words or whatever, or just like misread it and then be confused for the rest of the story. But I feel like when I'm reading out loud, I at least have like somewhat of a responsibility to say what is written down, you know? Um, and so I'm going back to something familiar today, at least familiar to me personally. I don't know about the podcast. We only did a couple conspiracy theory episodes, although this one's not even a conspiracy. Like this one, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you if you don't believe in the more conspiracy side of what I'm telling you today. But yeah, this is a familiar topic for me, at least as a person big into conspiracy theories. War Mode, of course, those were those were the guys that got me into it. But I do think that the way in which you approach conspiracy theories is important. Like for this one, I tried to only write down facts, just like statements of facts, and then I'll try to like differentiate between when I'm um just like expounding on things and like stating my own beliefs versus the actual facts that were, kind of uncovered during this investigation and during the course of the journalism surrounding this event, because I mean it's crazy, dude. This is literally just like Epstein 1.0, and I think they took what they learned from this one with what went wrong with this one, and they kind of applied it to Epstein. And I'll try to talk a little bit about that later if I can remember to do it. But yeah, no, this is a DC political scandal involving a guy with a mysterious source of income and young children, allegedly. Remind you of anything? I mean, it's crazy, and this is the sort of thing that like when people are like, well, they took Epstein down, so it's over. It's like, no, it's not, dude. The fact that we had an Epstein before Epstein means, at the very least, it means he wasn't the only, you know, child trafficker that dealt in the world of blackmail, allegedly. Allegedly. I'm just gonna say that 1,000 times in this episode, but um, yeah, try to keep it facts based because I feel like when you keep it facts based and then extrapolate out from the fact, it it's kind of harder for people to debunk what you're saying and go on Snopes or whatever and be like, well, actually, according to the people who were investigating themselves, that isn't true. And it's harder for people to do that when you state a fact and then say, because of that fact, I believe this and that, and sort of try to connect it to other facts as well and say, I mean, if all this is true, then I believe that there's a pretty good chance of this other thing being true. I think that's the best way to approach it, as opposed to just being like, I got a message from the Anunnaki and they told me Hillary Clinton's a lizard lady or whatever. And like, that's fun and all that stuff. But I think in order to like make anyone think about it, which people don't want to think, I understand. Uh, I rarely do it, so this is really the only time that I do think when I'm recording this. But I think in order to get people to think about it, you kind of have to you kind of have to treat it like you're teaching a child about something, right? Like that's what they say when you're writing essays in school. They say, explain it to me like I don't know what any of this is. And so I'm going to try my best to do that here today with the DC call boy scandal. Usually it's a call girl scandal, which, I mean, just the name in and of itself, like call girl, call boy, it's like, I get you don't want to say call man and call woman, but I'd err on the side of caution and start saying, I got a call woman instead of a call girl, right? Or if you're a man and you got a male prostitute, which that's kind of crazy. The idea of a male prostitute has always been crazy to me. It's like you can't find a guy to fuck you. Like I get, especially in this circumstance that we're going to be talking about today, men not might not be down for this type of fucking, but I'm sure you could find one. And I get it. There wasn't like Tinder or Grinder back then or whatever. So you maybe it was harder to go out and find men that would be down to do some of the things that were going on here. But yeah, I still think the idea of a male escort is kind of crazy. I'm like, that's the fact that, you always hear about like heroin addicts sucking dick for heroin or whatever. And it's like, I don't know, dude. I feel like if, especially in the modern age, sucking dick, if you're a man, really isn't a commodity anymore. It's like I can just open my phone and find a man to suck my dick right now. Now, if you're a woman, it's still a bit of a commodity, especially if it's an ugly man or whatever. But I think as a man, being down to suck and fuck is not as much of a commodity as it used to be for a number of reasons, including accessibility and just like the general openness of it all. Like you're not a lot of people are particularly scared these days of getting outed as gay or whatever. I'm sure it's still scary in a lot of ways to like, tell people this big thing, right? But I don't think there's like that threat of like life threatening, aura or like air around it. But we're getting a little off topic, so let's just jump into it. So the main guy that we're going to be talking about today is a guy named Craig J. Spence. And Craig J. Spence was born um, October 25th, 1940, in Ulster County, New York. This guy was born in upstate New York. Already we're talking about a garbage person. I guess this is the 1940s, so upstate New York is a little bit more industrialized than it is now. Like upstate New York now is it's just pills and just like Chernobyl. Like that's what it is. It's just Chernobyl without the radiation, right? Like if the Soviets never made the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, it would be upstate New York. Like that's what upstate New York is like nowadays. Back then, though, in the year 1940, it was probably still pretty nice. I don't remember. Maybe I think he was maybe born in Ithaca, upstate. I know that's one of the big cities up there. I think that's the city where he was born, but I wasn't exactly sure, so I just wrote down Ulster County because I know that's where he was from. I had to find like this guy, kind of like Epstein. A lot of the information about him is really buried. There's not a whole lot, so I had to find like a what's that called? Not an in memoriam, an obituary. I had to find an obituary about this guy to figure out where he was born at. Which really isn't that important, but I don't know. I just wanted to get the facts down. All right, and so upstate New York, he graduated from Syracuse University and began working at WCBS in New York before becoming a Southeast Asian correspondent for ABC News. So this guy, I think he majored in media or something like that. WCBS News, that's just kind of like it's like every local news, offshoot. That's what WCBS is, but it's just for New York. And I think he might have worked in like the radio division of that originally, if I remember correctly. And then he goes to ABC News to be a correspondent for Southeast Asia. So this is the 1960s, and he's a correspondent for ABC in Southeast Asia. Obviously, he's getting involved in the Vietnam War, and there's a lot of fishy stuff about the Vietnam War. I don't know too much about it. I know a lot about the war itself, but not a lot about, like the black ops and the heroin smuggling and all that other shit that people kind of talk about in there. So I'm not going to be able to talk about that as much, but in 1969, while being a war correspondent in Asia, he was banned from covering the Vietnam War by the government and relocated to Tokyo, where he began doing public relations for the Japan External Trade Organization. And to me, the whole thing about him getting banned by the government is actually a pretty big deal, especially in 1969. Because if you don't know, the reason that we have so much footage of like all the brutality and stuff in Vietnam is because there wasn't like I don't know what you would call it. It was more open to the media, right? To like the private media sector than like World War II. Like in World War II, for propaganda purposes, independent journalists really, they would go over to, Europe, and really not as much to Southeast Asia, but they would go over to Europe a lot to talk to American forces over there. But like it was all like planned out, and like all their footage would be reviewed and all that stuff. Whereas in the Vietnam War, it that doesn't exist. There was no like official government mandate about the type of journalism that could be conducted in Vietnam. It was kind of a free reign, you know what I mean? It was open season in Vietnam for the media. And so the fact that he was banned by the government for from covering the Vietnam War, to me that's a pretty big deal, because like I said, and we'll talk about this later, he alleged that he had connections to the CIA, and there were some rumblings that those connections went all the way back to the Vietnam War. And the CIA was heavily involved in the Vietnam War. You have things like Mac v. SOG, which was basically like this secret conglomeration of special forces in Vietnam that conducted operations in Cambodia and Laos, right? Cross-border operations and stuff like that. They would go places where they weren't necessarily supposed to be. Um, as stated by the regulations put down by the US, right? They weren't supposed to be over there. They didn't want to drag other countries into the war. And the CIA was heavily involved in Mac v. SOG, right? Like the Mac v. SOG guys, a lot of their shit was going into these Viet Cong bases, right? That were in Laos and Cambodia and stuff like that, and blowing them up and stuff. And in order to get that information, they'd have to go to the CIA. I don't know if I don't know if our boy Craig J. Spence was necessarily involved in Mac v. SOG, but there was just a lot of fishy CIA shit going on around then. That, like Mac v. SOG, for example, its existence wasn't known until like the 80s or 90s or something like that, right? Like there were guys in Mac v. SOG who got their Medal of Honor 30 years after the war because the way in which they earned the Medal of Honor, right? Like killing a bunch of enemies, the way that they got those, the way that they, achieved those awards was in places where they shouldn't have been. So yeah, Vietnam is just fishy in general. That's the point. And the fact that this guy gets banned from covering it in a time where it's like we have pictures of the My Lai massacre and all that stuff. We've got all like this media about it, but this guy gets banned from covering the war. I don't know. There's something fishy about that by the government, right? It wasn't the company he was working for that banned him. It was the government that banned him from covering the war. So that's pretty fishy. But he goes to Tokyo, does public relations for this group, and he stayed in Tokyo for a decade before he arrived in DC, where he became a well-known Japanese lobbyist and socialite. And socialite, I still, like, I understand what a socialite does, but it's just a crazy thing to me. You know what I mean? Especially when we're talking about DC. Like, I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's like all the Epstein stuff and all the stuff that's been coming out about like all the fishy stuff that happens in Washington or in like the finance sector in New York, but just like hearing the word socialite, to me, it just has this connotation of you do dirty shit. You know what I mean? To like get into these inner circles, right? Especially with like all the secret societies and stuff that a lot of these politicians are involved, right? Specifically the ones that went to Yale. Yale is a big CIA recruiting ground, and a lot of the recruits that come out of Yale are part of these secret societies in Yale, right? Like, or I guess not secret, but secretive societies in Yale, right? Like Skull and Bones. Most people have probably heard of that one. Like the Bush, all the Bushes were involved in Skull and Bones, and then you have a few others. It's like Lock and Key, Wolf's Head, like shit like that. And so just hearing the word socialite to me is just it rubs me the wrong way. It's like your entire thing is that you're good at throwing parties. It's like, I don't know, dude. You have to be doing something more than that, in my personal opinion. And I get it. There's a certain culture, a high class culture that I don't necessarily understand when it comes to dinner parties or whatever. But it's like, it doesn't seem that hard to me. It seems like there's something else there that makes you, a quote unquote socialite. I don't know. I could be wrong. But he's a Japanese lobbyist and a socialite, and Spence became well known for his parties, which, according to the New York Times in 1982, included a guest list of a who's who in Congress, government, and journalism. And another important thing to know about this affair, I don't know what you would call it, this whole situation is that there were allegedly a lot of religious figures involved, like high level religious figures. I'm assuming we're dealing with the Catholic Church here, right? Especially because like the Catholic Church, it's it's pretty unique, right? It's like this big centralized thing. It has this, central figurehead and all this stuff. It has like these super powerful guys that have a lot of money and political influence. And so that's why I assume it's the Catholic Church that they're talking about when they say high level religious leaders. But once again, this is like an Epstein type of thing, right? Where before Epstein got caught the first time, and even after he got caught the first time, there was all like these articles coming out, right? Like there was an episode of, I think it's an MTV show about like the life of the rich and famous and all that stuff about Jeffrey Epstein, right? He was like this guy who wasn't super well known, but he was a somewhat public figure who people weren't necessarily ashamed to say that they were around. And I don't know if that points to these people being guilty or not guilty, right? But I do think one of the things that maybe people don't understand about this as much, or at least my belief about it, that I have is that it's more of a slow burn than I think most people realize, right? Like when you become friends with Jeffrey Epstein, it isn't straight up like, okay, we're gonna go to an island where there's a bunch of kids or whatever. That I don't think, right? Once again, this is my belief. I don't think that that's necessarily what happens when you get involved with people like this, right? With people like Epstein and people like Craig J. Spence. I think it's more of a slow burn where you like look at that, you look at a chick and you go, she could be like 23 years old. She's probably not, but like I'm not gonna say anything about it, right? It's like a slow burn like that. Um, and eventually you get like fully indoctrinated into these circles, and they have all this blackmail on you. I think that's maybe why people weren't necessarily ashamed to be like, Craig J. Spence is my boy. It's because they were slowly getting like groomed into these circles where they would eventually get, blackmailed and all that stuff. Um, and so some guests included Attorney General John N. Mitchell, conservative political activist Phyllis Schlafly, I think that's how you say her name, future Trump attorney Roy Cohn, four-star Marine General Alfred M. Gray, and CIA Director William Casey. So, yeah, these are some pretty high-up people. This is going to come back later. This is one you got to remember. Actually, I think pretty soon we're going to talk about how these high-level how these high-level people are implicated in a meaningful way, right? Because it's like you could just be like, this is just a dinner party that I went to with the guy, but we're going to talk about some things later that in my personal opinion, implicate them on a more meaningful level than just like they didn't know this guy was a piece of shit and they were just like hanging out with him. And so, some important things to know: Attorney General. Obviously, everyone knows that's like one of the most powerful cabinet positions. But then, four-star Marine General. That is the highest level, pretty much, that in modern times at least, that can be achieved in terms of a military career. There's nothing higher than that. Yes, there has been some five-star generals in history. I have a list right here. George C. Marshall, Douglas MacArthur, Dwight Eisenhower, Henry H. Arnold, and Omar Bradley. And the only way really to become a five-star general is to be involved in some sort of coalition force, right? Like World War II. The reason that five-star generals exist is because during World War II, the Americans didn't want any of their generals, right, like Dwight D. Eisenhower, to be on the same rank or outranked by any of the European generals that they were working with. And so during a more peaceful time, right, like the mid-'80s, the four-star general is the highest level you can achieve. So this guy was basically, he controlled the Marine Corps. essentially. Um, and to me, the reason that that's impactful is because the Marine Corps is the only division. I don't know what the exact word is, but it's the only out of like the Army, Navy, Air Force, the only division that can just go out and do shit because the president said so is the Marine Corps, right? They're the only group of people that can do that. And so if you have blackmail on the guy who kind of controls what the Marine Corps does, then if you're the president, you can then have the Marines do whatever you want, right? Because remember, they don't have to get approval from Congress to send the Marine Corps. You know, that's why, like, during Desert Storm and stuff like that, it's always the Marine Corps that has boots on the ground first, is because the president is the only person that needs to authorize wartime activities of the Marine Corps. No one else needs to, and so that to me is significant. Um, and I just think having that military knowledge and have that understanding of it, because everyone understands, you know, the attorney general and the director of the CIA, and understands why those things are significant. But I think you might just be like, he's the general of the. Don't the Marines have to like listen to the president already? It's complicated. But anyway, so Spence, he was openly gay but still had deep ties to conservative social networks and journalists like Liz Trotta. And we're going to be talking a lot about Liz Trotta. That's a name you got to remember. And he, like I said, lobbies for the Japanese. He was also a pretty conservative guy, and this is a conservative time in Washington, D.C. I think this is, let me see if I can get a timeline of it, but this is like Bush, or not Bush, this is like Reagan era, and then I think it's going into Bush. Maybe it's Clinton. I can't remember which came first. Yeah, I think it's Reagan, Bush one, and then Clinton. Let me see. Oh my fucking god, this is the tiniest picture ever. Yeah, so this is Reagan going into Bush type of time. You know, Bush one, the smart one. And so yeah, it's he maybe necessarily wasn't conservative himself, right? He probably didn't give a shit. That's one of the things that I think about so much when we talk about guys like this, is that I don't think they give a shit about the politics. I don't think it matters to them. I think the only way in which it matters to them is in terms of creating, you know, allies and partnerships and things like that. Once again, my personal belief. But the fact remains, he was openly gay, although it wasn't super well known. But if you asked him, he was going to be like, I'm gay, right? And he did have deep ties to conservative social networks that includes lobbyists, politicians, things like that, and just a lot of journalists in general. And so Trotta and Spence met at the home of Leonard Bernstein, who was a closeted, maybe not closeted, definitely at the very least bisexual and sexually promiscuous uh, music composer, with public ties to Israel before becoming close friends as war correspondents in Vietnam. And so this guy, Leonard Bernstein, there's not a whole lot of facts that I could pull from to kind of tie him in super deeply to this conspiracy theory, but he's a super well-known public figure, and as we know, Hollywood is, and I don't know if he was necessarily a Hollywood guy, but like entertainment does have a lot of connections to the federal government that maybe are not super well known, right? Like I think one good example is Call of Duty. Call of Duty, I don't know anymore, right? But I know originally it was just straight up government propaganda. Like that's what Call of Duty was. Like I think it was the Department of Defense, if I remember correctly, that they gave Activision, I think that's who makes Call of Duty, they gave them like a fuck ton of money and said, hey, make some propaganda for us. Right? I don't think that's originally what Call of Duty was, but at some point in the Call of Duty series, the Department of Defense became a funder and kind of creative collaborator for these storylines and just like the game in general. And so while I couldn't find anything like that on Bernstein that's like a blatant, just a statement of fact, I could find that he did have pretty public ties to Israel, which That's a whole other can of worms that I'm not ready to open, but I just thought about putting that out there. Just being like, hey, not saying the guy did anything, but he did have public ties to Israel. And this this conspiracy theory kind of interconnects, not conspiracy theory, this human trafficking network interconnects with the Franklin scandal. And so if you want to know about that, listen to Nick Bryant. He knows a fuck ton about that one. I'm sure he's talked about this one too, but I've mostly heard him talk about the Franklin scandal and Epstein. And so yeah, I think I've heard him talk a little bit about Leonard Bernstein before, but nothing concrete. And so Liz Trotta and Craig J. Spence met for the first time with Bernstein. I don't know. Once again, I'm not saying Bernstein, he doesn't have any super obvious ties to intelligence networks, but he does have ties to Israel, and the Mossad and the CIA are super well connected, and just like the governments as a whole are super well interconnected. So there might be something there might not be. I don't know, but they met there, and then they became very close during the Vietnam War. And like we talked about, Craig Spence, there was something going on there. There was something weird about what happened in terms of Craig Spence getting banned from Vietnam during the war. And so Liz Trotter wrote extensively about Spence in her memoirs, where she recalled guest lists and midnight tours of the White House. And so, an important thing to know, I guess, about the White House during this time is that if you were a guard at the White House, you could just be like, all right, you're getting a tour now, which is insane, but I guess it's just how the security system operated back then. That's going to come into play a little bit later, when the whole story starts to spill out and Craig J. Spence starts to speak publicly about what was going on. But yeah, during this time, if I guess if you were just manning the gate, just a fucking security guard at the White House with your, that same like gray button-up shirt that all fucking security guys wear, if you were that guy, you could just let anyone into the White House whenever you wanted, which I I guess that's true. I guess that's true, but I don't know. There's still a whole lot of weird stuff later that we're going to talk about. And so on June 29th, 1989, the Washington Times, which I just want to put this out there, it's a conservative newspaper. The Washington Times published a front page article about the Vinston prostitution ring, which was under investigation by the Secret Service, DC Police, and United States Attorney's Office for credit card fraud. I know the Secret Service handles stuff with money. I know that's one of the things they do. So that's kind of understandable why they're investigating this credit card fraud. DC police, very understandable why they're dealing with this situation. But then the United States Attorney's Office, maybe they deal with like a lot of federal cases, and I know a lot of shit involving money is a federal case, or it becomes federal in some way, shape, or form. But I don't know. That one seems a little bit weird to me. It's like the United States Attorney's Office is taking time out of their day to deal with this fucking gay dude who's like selling prostitutes or whatever. Not like, not selling prostitutes, but he's a pimp, right? And the United States Attorney's Office is investigating for him for some reason. Like I said, I know the Secret Service handles a lot of stuff with money, and so that's kind of understandable why they're there. Although they're most well known for protecting the president and stuff like that. So I don't know, make your own conclusions about that one. But the United States Attorney's Office is the one that really weirds me out about this. And still, nothing about this article necessarily implicated Spence in anything that was like super illegal, right? I guess you can have a brothel. I know that there's loopholes and all that stuff about like, no, it's not a prostitute, it's an escort, and if the escort wants to have sex with you, then oh, so be it, right? And so maybe that's why this organization was allowed to kind of publicly operate and stuff like that. But Spence he's not necessarily in trouble for anything so far, but he was involved in this gay prostitution ring. And so Spence was a regular client of Vincent's Ebony and Ivory brothel and was known to spend over 20K a month despite no discernible source of income. Right? He probably did get some money from like being a lobbyist and stuff like that. Maybe he was still doing some journalism shit at the time, but $20,000 a month on gay prostitutes. He there was no reason why he even could have been spending that money, right? It's not like he had the money and it's just like, why are you spending it? No, there's no source of income that can reasonably justify spending $20,000 a month on prostitutes or anything really in general. The prostitution is rather unimportant at this point. It's where is he getting the $20,000? And $20,000 was like a regular thing for him. It wasn't just like, oh, he just spent $20,000 this month and 200 all the other months. He was consistently spending a very high amount of money that went up to $20,000 a month on these prostitutes. Once again, prostitution isn't really the key thing necessarily to focus on at this point. It's where is he getting this $20,000 from? We know he's throwing all these lavish parties. There's very high level people there. William Casey, director of the CIA, went to at least one of these parties that we know of. Where's he getting the money from? Hey, I'm just asking questions. All right, where is he getting $20,000 a month to spend on gay prostitutes? We might have an answer that's extra governmental, if that makes sense. Like, it's not necessarily directly linked to the CIA or the Marine Corps general or anything like that. But it's pretty weird that he has all these high-level connections in like this mysterious source of income that allows him to spend $20,000 a month on. It's not like his house or anything. It's $20,000 a month in 1989, by the way, which I don't know what that is in terms of inflation. It's probably like $100,000 a month or fucking something insane like that, if you want to put it in terms of inflation. But yeah, where's he getting this money from? I think that to me is the main question. Also, why is he spending $20,000 on prostitutes? Like, even if you're getting your dick sucked once a day by like the most high level prostitute, I feel like we're maxing out at about at maybe 10 grand a month, maybe, especially at this point in time. And he's spending $20,000 a month. There were allegedly orgies and stuff that he was involved in, but they weren't just involving the prostitutes, right? There was other people allegedly involved in some of these big these big sweaty gay orgies that Craig J. Spence was throwing. And so on one occasion, Spence invited Vincent to his house where Lawrence King, this is a little bit of a cameo from the Franklin scandal, he was a Franklin scandal suspect, and GOP politician was present. So this guy, Lawrence King, he is both a suspect in the Franklin scandal and he's a GOP politician. GOP just means Republican conservative. That's what the GOP is. And so he invites this boy Vincent over, and Vincent is a pretty solid guy. He's actually a pretty decent guy. Yes, he runs a gay prostitution ring. I don't know. Like, being a gay pimp, to me, the moral implication, right? The implication that he's like a immoral person there isn't as great, right? Because if you told a gay dude, hey, you can suck and fuck and earn $5 grand a month or whatever, right? It's not like with women where it's harder to sort of get them into this lifestyle, and it usually involves a lot of coercion and drugs and things like that. A gay dude sucking and fucking for $5 grand a month, that guy must be happy as a clam. you see what I'm getting at here? And we're going to talk about some other reasons why this guy Vincent's actually kind of a fucking beast. Why this gay prostitute guy is kind of a beast. Once again, I think I've heard Nick Bryant talk about him in a positive light, so maybe that's why I have this sort of view of Vincent. But even from just the few facts that I know about him, this guy kind of fucking rules. He's a gay pimp, and we're going to talk about some other reasons why he's the man, why he rules so much. So During this visit, Spence alleged that the CIA had wired his house with surveillance equipment, and King spoke of a joint effort with Spence that involved trafficking children and murdering them as well, which that gets into the whole, human sacrifice frazzle drip thing of Hillary Clinton cutting off a kid's face and wearing it as a mask or whatever. That's kind of where I start to. It's not where I stop believing in it necessarily, but it's like I'm not gonna. We'll talk about that. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. At this point, there's some more stable facts that we can go on that implicate these politicians in a pedophile, in some sort of pedophilic way. And so I think kind of addressing that first before we address cutting off someone's face and drinking their blood, not not that they shouldn't also get in trouble for cutting off someone's face and drinking their blood or whatever, but we have more concrete evidence to point them to these things that aren't as bad, but they are horrific, right? And so one of the big things that they talked about with this child trafficking ring that Vincent alleged is that they were flying kids coast to coast, which this is the 80s, 90s. This is pre 9/11 and all that stuff. So it's not like now where we have like all the security and you have to show fucking 17 IDs. Okay, you guys can't hear that. All right. It's not like now. God damn, my mom is using the most powerful vacuum known to man right now. Whatever. But still, trafficking kids coast to coast using planes, I think that's specifically what they said, is still like it's a tall task, even in, pre 9/11 times. Damn. All right. Sorry. I'm sorry if you guys can hear that or whatever. So on another visit, King and Spence tried to convince Vincent into ensnaring children for them. And after this, Vincent refused to service Spence. And there was this other guy named Tony that was involved. I didn't look into Tony too much, but I think this is where the credit card fraud sort of comes into play, where Spence asked Vincent to process. All right, so Spence asked Vincent to process like credit card payments or something for his friend Tony. So I think that's kind of sort of where Spence starts to get implicated in the credit card investigation that's being done by the Secret Service, DC Police, and the United States Attorney's Office. And so, but yeah, Vincent basically stopped fucking with him. After this, he was like, "No, I'm not going to start sending you any more prostitutes or anything like that." Like, one of the big things that Vincent noted about Spence is that he asked for like boyish looking prostitutes, right? He was like, "I want someone who's over the age of 18, but like, maybe some other things about them don't quite look like they're 18, right?" Like that's one of the things that Spence was like, that's a little bit weird. And for him to remember that as like a pimp, I don't know. I feel like it has to be pretty notable for this guy to be like, that was weird. I remember that. I remember Spence asking for like young looking prostitutes, right? He wasn't asking for like the guys that were in shape and had like, I don't know, big butts or whatever, right? I think gay dudes are also the big butts. He wasn't asking for that. He was asking for these boyish looking male prostitutes. And so that was something else that he noted. So Vincent didn't really do anything past that point, but he also didn't impede on any sort of investigation, and he spoke openly about Spence and all that stuff. But yeah, that's why the guy's a beast. The guy's a beast because A, he's a gay pimp, which is, it's cooler than being a female pimp, and then B, this isn't like the most morally upstanding thing anyone's ever done, but like having this client who you make all this money off of, right? Probably close to $250,000 a year in some cases, and kind of outright denying him and being like, not only am I not going to help you with your child trafficking, I'm going to refuse your business as a whole. And this wasn't a guy with like a house full of hoes or whatever. This was like a kind of a more official business, a pretty high level business, right? In terms of the prostitutes that he provided to people. So he wasn't going to be like hurting for money, but to deny this guy's business, I do think shows a lot of moral character in a story where there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of moral character, if that makes sense. Not saying he's the greatest guy ever, but I think he's very far from the worst, and he's definitely, in my opinion, the most morally upstanding person in this story. Liz Trotta, I don't know. She's fishy. There's something weird about Liz Trotta. And so Vincent, I think was one of his this was like an interview in some article or something like that, but one of Vincent's escorts confirmed that Spence sent them on late night tours uh, of the White House where they were waved through the front gate, and also claimed that minors had been present at Spence's parties, right? And so when someone waves you through the front gate, kind of what that means is just come on through, right? It implies that, first of all, it doesn't imply, it blatantly states that Spence wasn't there for these visits, right? Like I talked about earlier when I said the security guards could just let people come through that they knew for White House tours kind of whenever. This isn't, this doesn't seem like that to me, in my personal opinion. The prostitute states that the guy just waved him through and stuff like that. So he's not even, Spence isn't even there for these tours, quote unquote tours. He's not even there for these tours, and they're not even checking these people, like their IDs or anything like that. They're not checking their IDs. They're not checking, patting them down to see if they're smuggling in weapons or drugs or anything like that. They're not doing any of these things. So what that implies to me, right, my personal belief, this isn't a statement of fact, but what that implies to me is he has some pretty high level connections to just be like, hey, the president, where the president lives at, a couple people are going to swing by there later. Don't search him or anything, just let him on through. To me, that implicates that he has connections to people who have a high level of power and are probably within the inner circle of the president of the United States. That's kind of what that implies to me. And then also the thing about the minors at the parties, there's no need for extrapolation there. That one's pretty straightforward. There's kids involved in this in some way or another, and obviously, according to Vincent, Lawrence King, Franklin scandal, that was there was no like gay prostitution ring or whatever in the Franklin scandal to kind of like put up a curtain about the involvement of children. It straight up was a child trafficking ring and stuff like that. Like that's what the Franklin scandal is. And it also, I think, originally started as some sort of financial investigation. So another weird one like that. Follow the money. I think that's kind of probably how they got Epstein the first time. They just followed the money, and then it turned into this whole big thing. So another story is So this thing where the escort talks about just getting waved through the front gate, from this 3 Secret Service guards were furloughed by the Secret Service. That's the only thing that came out of this. 3 dudes. There was this one guy, I forget his name. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It's like Richard DeGear or something like that. If I can find it at all in here. But this guy, he was one of the main, Reginald de Goldry. However you say his name, sounds fucking French as shit, which makes sense why he's involved in gay prostitution and kids. Like, fuck those people. But anyway, he was one of the main guys that got in trouble for this, but Spence was basically like, no, he just gave us the tours of the White House. Like, yeah, he probably knew what we were doing and all that stuff, but he wasn't the reason that we got in there, right? The reason we got in there was because fucking I had the district attorney, or not the district attorney, the fucking attorney general coming to my parties and stuff like that, right? Like he He says that's why they got in. And this guy Reginald DeGoldray or whatever, he was just giving us the tours and stuff like that. He was just showing us around. Um, and yeah, more than one tour at the White House. That's another weird thing. Implies that you're there not just for the tour. It's like you don't want to just this guy who's spending $20,000 a month on gay prostitutes. I don't imagine that he just wants to look at like the bronze bust of George Washington's head again. I seems like there's something else going on there, where this guy doesn't just want to look at like the blue carpet of the Oval Office or whatever. What desk is Reagan using? Which one is he? It's not just that. There's something more to it, in my personal opinion. And so, another story is that one male soldier alleged that Spence enticed him into sex with I put female in quotes, maybe it's not female, but a female prostitute, and used photos to blackmail him into, quote unquote, beating up a couple of guys. And afterwards, the soldier refused sex with Spence, who showed the pictures to his wife, which led to a separation. So I had a couple things in quotes in that little bullet point there, which was female. Spence, at least publicly, at least as far as we know, there's not a whole lot of involvement with female prostitutes, although I'm sure there could be. And then the whole beating up a couple of guys. This guy is spending $20,000 a month on gay prostitutes. He's going to have, it's not going to be a tough task for him to go and find a guy and say, hey, go break someone's kneecaps real quick. You think you can do me a favor? Okay, go break this guy's kneecaps for me, and I'll give you $1,000, right? $1,000 is 5% of what he spends on gay prostitutes a month. So the whole beating up a couple of guys, to me, it's what the soldier said, but to me it seems a little bit fishy, because it's just like, this guy Spence, he clearly has a lot of access. He clearly is not too worried about getting in any legal trouble or anything like that. And so it's like, why would he need to blackmail a guy to go give someone a black eye, right? Why would he need to do that? It just doesn't add up to me, in my personal opinion. All right, and so as the expose continued, Spence became more involved with callboys and crack while trying to evade authorities. Okay, he might have got more involved with crack, but I cannot think of a single way in which he could have gotten more involved with these with these gay prostitutes. I don't see a reality where that's fucking possible, dude. He's spending $20,000 a month. There's orgies going on and all sorts of stuff like that. And somehow he became more involved with these gay prostitutes. And clearly at this point, he's not getting them from Vincent anymore, right? Because remember, Vincent, after the whole thing with Lawrence King, Vincent was like, no, I'm not doing this. You're not a person I want to be around. I don't want to even send you prostitutes. You're a bad guy. I'm just a gay pimp, dude, right? Like, that's basically what Vincent said to him. And so clearly Spence is not getting these gay prostitutes from Vincent anymore, so he's getting them from somewhere else. And I'm sure, like I said, I don't think it's particularly hard to find a gay prostitute, but it's weird to me, about how even after this whole thing happens and he's evading authorities. It's like, just follow the fucking prostitute. Wherever there's a bunch of gay prostitutes and there's like an orgy going on, that's where fucking Spence is, all right? It's the idea that this guy's evading authorities while getting hundreds of gay prostitutes to his house is fucking insane to me, right? It's like, I don't know, it's just weird. I don't think it was hard to find, is what I'm trying to say. And so the idea that he was trying to evade authorities. Now, the authorities they were trying to subpoena him to get him to like testify in court about the Vincent credit card fraud case. That's what they were trying to get him to do. And so they weren't trying to arrest him necessarily at this point, despite what Vincent's escorts said about the late night tours of the White House and the parties involving minors. They're still not trying to arrest him, which is fucking insane to me, dude. It's crazy. It's crazy that they're not trying to arrest him, especially in the height of the crack epidemic. Like I said, this is Reagan Bush 1 type of era that we're dealing with here. So, yeah, I don't know. I think the authorities weren't trying to get him as hard as they said they were. I think they were kind of told to stand down by some people, if I had to guess. And so anyway, on July 31st, 1989, Spence was arrested in New York City for criminal possession of a firearm and cocaine. And once again, they talk about how he was getting more involved in crack. And an important thing you have to understand about this time in history is obviously we have the crack epidemic going on. And a lot of people know about the way in which crack was treated worse than cocaine. It was treated as 100 times worse, right? Like, if you had 3.5 grams of cocaine, then you were charged with having 3.5 grams of cocaine. If you had 3.5 grams of crack, then you were charged with having, what's 3.5 times 100? You had 1 0 in there. Yeah, you were charged with having 350 grams of cocaine on you if you had 3.5 or 3.5 grams of crack. Yeah. And so they're talking about how he's getting involved in crack, but then they're like, he got arrested for cocaine. And it's like, to me, what I extrapolate out of that is that they didn't want to arrest him for crack for some reason. I don't know what it is, but they didn't want to arrest him for crack. Maybe because, this might have turned into a whole bigger deal, right? Or he would have gone to a different prison or something like that. And by the way, he doesn't go to jail. He doesn't go to jail during any of this. He's caught with allegedly cocaine, but I suspect crack, in kind of a peak time for cracking down on crack. A little bit of a joke there, for cracking down on crack. And he doesn't go to jail. And he also has criminal possession of a firearm in New York City. Once again, during the crack epidemic, where New York City is kind of an epicenter for these things. And yeah, it's just weird that he doesn't go to jail during any of this. During any of this, he maybe gets arrested, but he does not spend a significant amount of time in jail at any point during his life. At no point during his life does he spend any notable amount of time in jail, despite having crack on him during a time where they would throw you in jail for life for that shit. And also the alleged involvement with minors at the parties and stuff like that. It seems like there's powerful people protecting him at this point in time. And so in August of 1989, remember, he's arrested on July 31st, and then in August of 1989, Spence was interviewed for 8 hours by the Washington Times, where he alleged that then National Security Advisor Donald Gregg set up the visits to the White House. So I said earlier, I think I talked about the Attorney General. Spence himself alleges that Donald Gregg, head of national security, was the one who set up the visits to the White House, right? Like I said earlier, the waving through of random people, right? People that, like I said, the security guards were allowed to give visits to the White House or tours of the White House to people that they knew. But the waving through of people that the security guard can't know, he can't know who these people are. These are random gay prostitutes from Vincent's brothel, right? That, like I said, implied to me a rational person who is not smoking crack like Craig J. Spence is at this point. Me, a rational person, looks at that and says, well, there's something fishy going on here that implicates more than just a few little fucking security guards, right? And Vincent, who probably is on crack at this point, he gave an 8-hour interview to the Washington Times. He's probably getting a little bit of, or at the very least, a little booger sugar, you know what I mean? He says that it was National Security Advisor Donald Gregg. So, yeah. And then on November 10th, 1989, right, just a couple months after he's arrested, Spence was found dead and barricaded in room 429 of the Boston Ritz-Carlton. And I know numerology is a big thing in conspiracy theories nowadays. If you've ever listened to War Mode, then you know what numerology is, but it's basically just the idea that, like, numbers act as symbols a lot of the time. I don't know if 429, if there's any people that are into numerology out there, then maybe you know what that one is, but I kind of wanted to look into it, but then I was like, nah, I kind of want to stick to the facts on this one and, what people said and what they alleged and stuff like that. Instead of getting into the fucking star symbols that the Anunnaki used to communicate with the Egyptians who built the pyramids, right? Instead of getting into that, I kind of wanted to stick to the facts here. So once again, all I'm saying here is facts. And so Spence was found dressed in the usual attire of his dinner parties next to a newspaper clipping. This is all a fact. About efforts to protect CIA agents from testifying before government agencies. He was found. Oh yeah, look, I get it. Some people might call me a fucking schizo or whatever for being super into conspiracy theories, but this guy is found in the dress of these dinner parties that allegedly involved minors and, according to one soldier, definitely involved sexual blackmail, next to a newspaper clipping about preventing CIA agents from testifying in front of government agencies. And remember, he's not going to jail. I didn't hear anything about a court case in what I read at all. He didn't go in front of a judge or anything like that. Once again, after he alleges that the CIA were the ones that set up all the surveillance equipment in his house, and the surveillance equipment was there. That's just a fact at this point. His house was wired to the brim with video surveillance equipment, right? As is obvious from the whole soldier talking about how he was blackmailed by Spence and stuff like that. And so we know there's video surveillance equipment. There's probably audio surveillance equipment. I mean, it's cut and dry to me. Like, I don't know how anyone thinks that this guy wasn't involved, in the very least, with sexual blackmail that almost definitely involved intelligence agencies. I mean, it's very clear to me. And so, on a mirror in his room, Spence allegedly wrote in a Sharpie, "Chief, consider this my resignation effective immediately. As you always said, you can't ask others to make a sacrifice if you are not willing to do the same. Life is duty. God bless America." I don't know. That sounds like something a CIA agent would say before he swallows a cyanide pill in fucking Moscow or something like that. Like, that's what that seems like to me. Life is duty. God bless America. Forgetting what he said about chief or whatever. God bless America. Life is duty. I don't know. And I know people that just kind of want to live in this fantasy land where nothing bad ever happens. Want to just be like, whoa, well, he was just a crazy guy who thought he was in the CIA. He's like, what's that guy's name? John Nash, the mathematician, the schizophrenic mathematician who thought the CIA was sending him letters in the newspaper. Like, I know some people want to just say that, but this guy's a coherent individual who is socially incredibly capable, right? Like, you can say that a schizophrenic is able to function in some ways, but socially is not one of the ways in which a true, like, paranoid schizophrenic is able to properly function. They're just not. They always have some sort of blatant social issue that, and remember, this guy's a socialite. His whole thing is being social, right? And so for someone to say to me that, oh, well, this guy's just schizophrenic, he's out of his fucking mind or whatever, it's, I mean, he can't be. He can't be. This guy is too well connected socially. He was covering his tracks very well. Towards the end, he started to pop off a little bit with the blackmailing the soldier and all that stuff, and smoking crack or whatever. But he writes like this incredibly coherent sentence, right? He's dressed in these clothes. He has a newspaper clipping about the CIA. I don't know what else you could think at that point, is all I'm saying. And so during the August interview, Spence told the reporter and Liz Trotta that all that's been uncovered was insignificant compared to other things that he's done, and that they wouldn't be able to, quote unquote, solve the big thing. Remind you of anyone? I mean, this guy's just Epstein. He's just the OG Epstein at this point. And so the credit card investigation of the Ebony and Ivory brothel continued, and no prominent figures were ever charged. in the credit card case or in the sexual blackmail case. And that's the fucking story. I mean, yeah. It's just like Epstein, how Epstein turned out, where they killed him or he killed himself, and then the whole thing ended. You know, they ran this playbook before, and like I said, I think that they learned from from Craig J. Spence in order to change what they did with Epstein, right? Where it's with Epstein, immediately put him in jail, pretty quickly killed him when he was in there. They didn't have him in the middle of Washington, D.C. They had him on a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which had this whole weird jurisdiction around him and stuff like that. I think Craig J. Spence was maybe the prototype, or maybe the first prototype, right? The first prototype that we know of to create this sort of sexual blackmail ring. Obviously, this is the 80s and 90s, so, and Craig J. Spence, he was involved more with conservative politicians, and so he necessarily maybe didn't have to do sexual blackmail involving children. He just had to do it with men, right? In order to get these people to listen to him. But nowadays, I do think you do have to involve children in a sexual blackmail ring and stuff like that. And so, yeah, this video is probably going to get taken down off of YouTube or whatever, but no one fucking listens anyway, so I don't really give a shit. But yeah, pretty unsatisfying ending there. But I hope everyone listening has a good day, a good week, a good year, a good life, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.